Every person deserves dignity, yet here stood a woman, stripped of everything but her fierce spirit. Love finds us in the darkest places, when we least expect it and need it most. The rain pounded the cobblestones as the auction block stood empty, except for one defiant figure. Lira's green eyes blazed with unbroken will, her scarred wrists telling stories of countless escape attempts. The crowd had gone home with their purchases, leaving whispered warnings about the dangerous Omega who injured 3 handlers. She was beautiful, but wild. No man dared claim such trouble. Then King Ronan emerged from the shadows, his battle-worn face showing 43 years of ruling through strength alone. The auctioneer was shocked that royalty would want this woman. But Ronan saw something others missed, the same restless fire he had buried under his crown. What happens when 2 broken souls recognize each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The storm had been building for 3 days, matching the tempest in Lira's heart as she endured her 7th auction in as many months. Each time she had been returned like faulty merchandise, too defiant, too dangerous, too much trouble for any reasonable master. The iron shackles around her wrists bore fresh scratches from her latest escape attempt, testament to a spirit that refused to bend despite weeks of captivity. She remembered the night they took her. Raiders had swept through her village like a plague of locusts, burning homes and snatching anyone young and strong enough to fetch a price at market. Lira had fought then too, sending 2 men to their graves before sheer numbers overwhelmed her. The memory of her younger brother's terrified face as they dragged him away still haunted her dreams, if she ever allowed herself to sleep deeply enough to dream. The slave market of Greenvale sprawled across what had once been a grand plaza, now transformed into a theater of human misery. Wooden platforms rose from the cobblestones like funeral pyres, each one witness to countless broken lives and shattered families. The scent of unwashed bodies, fierce sweat and despair hung heavy in the air, mixing with the acrid smoke from the torches that provided the only warmth on this cold, wet evening. Marcus the auctioneer, a round man whose prosperity came from others' suffering, had grown increasingly frustrated as the day wore on. Lira was his last lot, and he'd already made 3 attempts to sell her. Each time, interested bidders had withdrawn their offers once they learned of her reputation. Word traveled fast in the slave trade. She was the Omega who'd bitten off, a handler's finger who'd set fire to a merchant's wagon during transport, who'd somehow picked every lock they'd put on her, despite never having seen such mechanisms before. "Look at her," Marcus called to the dwindling crowd, his voice hoarse from hours of hawking human flesh. "Strong as an ox, young enough to bear many children, and beautiful enough to grace any household." His words rang hollow even to his own ears. The few remaining buyers huddled under makeshift canopies, more interested in staying dry than in purchasing trouble. Lira stood motionless on the platform, rain streaming down her face like tears she refused to shed. Her long, dark hair clung to her shoulders, and her simple brown dress, the same one she'd worn the night of her capture, hung heavy with moisture. But her eyes burned with an inner fire that no amount of rain could extinguish. She had learned to find strength in her fury, to let her anger warm her when nothing else could. An older woman in the crowd, perhaps a cook or housekeeper shopping for kitchen help, shook her head and moved away. "That one's got the devil in her eyes," she muttered to her companion. "No good can come of bringing such wildness under roof." A merchant from the eastern provinces had circled back twice, clearly, drawn by Lira's beauty despite the warnings. He was a soft-looking man with pale hands that had never known hard work, the kind who probably thought an Omega's spirit could be broken with enough patience and cruelty. But even he hesitated when Marcus recounted her history of rebellion. "She's untrained, you say?" the merchant asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Independent-minded," Marcus replied diplomatically, though sweat beaded his forehead despite the cool evening air. Perhaps better suited to a master with experience in handling spirited stock. The merchant's eyes narrowed as he studied Lira more carefully. She met his gaze with such unveiled contempt that he actually took a step backward. Whatever fantasies had been playing in his mind clearly evaporated under the weight of her stare. He turned and walked away without another word. As the evening deepened and the rain intensified, the crowd thinned further. Mothers with children hurried home to dry hearths and warm meals. Traders packed their goods and headed for taverns where they could count their profits and plan tomorrow's ventures. Even the guards, who usually lingered to maintain order, had retreated to covered doorways, leaving only the most desperate dealers in human flesh. Lira had been counting the hours by the church bells that tolled across the square. 7 o'clock had come and gone. Soon the market would officially close, and she would be loaded back into the prison wagon for another uncomfortable night before being hauled to the next town, the next auction, the next humiliation. She almost preferred it this way, at least. Traveling meant she wasn't trapped in some master's household, enduring whatever cruelties his imagination could devise. The broken shackles at her feet told their own story. These were the 4th set they'd put on her since her capture. The first pair she'd worked loose, using a hairpin she'd kept hidden in her boot. The second had been stronger, but she'd managed to slip them by dislocating her thumb, a skill she'd learned from an old poacher in her village who'd needed to escape various traps over the years. The third set had been more challenging, requiring her to wait until the wagon hit a particularly rough patch of road, using the momentum to slam the chains against a protruding nail until the metal fatigued and snapped. Each escape attempt had earned her harsher treatment, tighter bonds, more suspicious guards. But it had also earned her something more valuable, a reputation that preceded her from market to market. She was becoming known as the unsellable Omega, the woman too dangerous to own. And with each passing day, each failed sale, she felt a grim satisfaction that she was costing these flesh merchants more than they could ever hope to profit from her misery. Marcus was growing desperate. The rain was driving away what few potential buyers remained, and his other sellers were packing their wares and heading for shelter. He'd already paid the market fees, hired the guards, and transported Lira from the last town where she'd failed to sell. If he couldn't move her tonight, he'd be operating at a loss, something that went against every fiber of his greedy soul. "Perhaps we should call it a night," suggested Henrik, one of his regular guards. The man's cloak was soaked through, and he'd been eyeing the warm glow of the tavern across the square for the past hour. "We can try again tomorrow in Millbrook." "No!" Marcus snapped, though his own teeth were beginning to chatter. "I'll not be beaten by this stubborn wench. Someone will see her value before the night is through." As if summoned by his words, a new figure approached from the shadows at the edge of the square. At first, Marcus could make out only the outline of a tall man wrapped in a dark cloak, moving with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command. The stranger's boots splashed through puddles without regard for the muddy water, and something in his bearing made both the auctioneer and his guards straighten unconsciously. It wasn't until the man stepped into the circle of torchlight that gasps rippled through the few remaining onlookers. King Ronan of Thornwick stood before them, as unexpected as lightning from a clear sky. His presence transformed the sordid slave market into something else entirely, a stage where fate itself might unfold. Marcus fell to his knees so quickly that his bulk sent up a splash of muddy water. "Your Majesty, I had no idea. We are honored by your presence, though surely this humble market is beneath your notice." Ronan ignored the groveling merchant, his pale blue eyes fixed entirely on the woman who stood defiantly on the auction block. Even drenched and bedraggled, even wearing the simple clothes of a captive, she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of noble blood. But it wasn't her beauty that caught his attention, stunning though she was. It was the fire in her eyes, the unbroken spirit that blazed like a beacon in the dark night. For 43 years, Ronan had ruled through strength and strategic thinking. He'd fought wars, negotiated treaties, and maintained peace through careful balance of fear and respect. He'd buried his own dreams beneath the weight of the crown, learned to suppress his emotions in service of his people's needs. Yet something in this woman's defiant gaze awakened a part of him he'd thought long dead, the part that had once dreamed of freedom, of choosing his own path rather than accepting the destiny thrust upon him by birthright and duty. "She is not for sale to you, your majesty." Henrik dared to speak, his voice shaking with nervousness. "This one is dangerous, untrainable. She has injured several men and attempted escape countless times. Surely a king would want more suitable." "I will decide what I want." Ronan's voice cut through the rain like a blade, quiet but carrying absolute authority. His gaze never left Lira's face, and she stared back at him with equal intensity. Neither of them willing to look away first. Marcus scrambled to his feet, sensing opportunity despite his confusion. "Of course, your majesty. She is yours for whatever price you deem fair. Though I should mention her asking price was, name it." The simple command carried such finality that Marcus nearly choked on his next words. He'd been about to quote his standard price, but facing actual royalty, his merchant's instincts screamed for him to ask for more, yet something in the king's manner warned against pushing too hard. 50 gold sovereigns, your majesty," he finally managed, his voice barely audible above the rain. Ronan reached into his cloak and withdrew a leather purse, never breaking eye contact with Lira. He tossed it to Marcus without looking, and the merchant caught it with fumbling hands. The weight of it suggested far more than 50 coins. "Consider the extra payment for your discretion," Ronan said, his voice carrying a warning that needed no elaboration. "This transaction never happened. You never saw me here tonight." "Of course, your majesty. You have my word. Our complete silence is assured." Marcus bobbed his head frantically, clutching the purse to his chest like a lifeline. Throughout this exchange, Lira had remained frozen on the platform, her mind struggling to process what was happening. She'd prepared herself for another night in the prison wagon, another journey to another market, another day of being paraded before men who saw her as nothing more than property to be acquired. The appearance of actual royalty and his inexplicable decision to purchase her had shattered all her expectations. What disturbed her most was not his presence but her reaction to it. When their eyes had met, she'd felt something she hadn't experienced since her capture, recognition, as though she were looking at a kindred spirit rather than just another potential master. The feeling was so unexpected, so unwanted, that it made her angrier than any amount of chains or degradation ever had. She would not be grateful for this development. She would not allow herself to hope that a king might prove different from other men who'd sought to own her. Whatever his motivations, whatever he saw when he looked at her, she would show him the same defiance she'd shown all the others. Crown or no crown, he would learn that Lira of Millhaven could not be possessed by any man, no matter his station. The rain continued to fall as King Ronan stepped closer to the platform, his presence seeming to fill the entire square despite the modest number of witnesses. In that moment, as their eyes remained locked in silent challenge, both of them sensed that their lives were about to change in ways neither could imagine. The storm-soaked auction block had served its purpose. The last transaction of the evening was complete, but for Lira and Ronan, everything was just beginning. The leather purse hit the muddy ground with a satisfying thud as Lira knocked it from Marcus's trembling hands. Every eye in the square turned toward her, but she kept her blazing gaze fixed on the king, who thought he could buy her like a prize mare at market. "I am not for sale," she declared, her voice cutting through the rain with crystalline clarity. "Not to merchants, not to farmers, and certainly not to kings who fancy themselves collectors of broken things." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus scrambled in the mud for his scattered coins, his face pale with terror at the implications of this public defiance. The guards' hands moved instinctively toward their weapons, unsure whether to protect their king or flee from the potential consequences of this unprecedented situation. But Ronan didn't flinch. If anything, the corner of his mouth curved into what might have been the ghost of a smile. Here was the fire he'd recognized, the unbroken spirit that had called to something deep within his own carefully controlled soul. Her rebellion only confirmed what he'd sensed the moment he'd laid eyes on her. "You speak as though you have a choice in the matter," he said quietly, stepping closer to the platform. His voice held no anger, no threats, just a statement of fact that somehow carried more weight than any amount of shouting would have. Lyra's chin lifted higher. "I always have a choice. I've chosen to escape 7 times, to fight every man who's tried to claim me, to remain unbroken despite everything they've done." She gestured toward her scarred wrists, the evidence of her countless attempts at freedom. "What makes you think you'll succeed where others have failed?" "Because I'm not trying to break you." The simple statement hung in the air between them, more shocking than any threat or demand for submission. Lyra's eyes narrowed as she tried to decipher his meaning, searching for the trap hidden in his words. In her experience, men who claimed not to want her broken were often the cruelest of all. "Then what do you want?" she demanded, rain streaming down her face like the tears she refused to shed. Ronan was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those pale blue eyes that seemed to see past all her defenses. When he finally spoke, his words were so unexpected that they momentarily robbed her of speech. "I want to understand what drives someone to keep fighting when any reasonable person would have surrendered long ago." Before Lira could formulate a response, Henrik cleared his throat nervously. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. The rain is worsening, and there are still witnesses." "Yes," Ronan agreed, though his eyes never left Lyra's face. "We'll return to Thornwick immediately." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Lira stated flatly, crossing her arms despite the chains that still bound her wrists. "You can keep your gold. I didn't ask to be rescued, and I certainly didn't ask for a new master." "You're right," Ronan said, surprising everyone within earshot. "You didn't ask for any of this, but the transaction is complete. The coin has been paid, and legally you belong to me now whether you like it or not." He paused, letting the reality sink in. "The question is whether you'll come willingly or force me to have you dragged. Either way, you're leaving this place tonight." The steel beneath his courteous words was unmistakable. This was a king accustomed to being obeyed, a man who'd spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Yet there was something in his manner that suggested he would genuinely prefer her cooperation to her resistance. Lira weighed her options quickly. She could fight, of course, throw herself from the platform, try to lose herself in the dark streets of Green Vale, but the king's guards were already moving to surround the square, cutting off potential escape routes with the efficiency of men trained in warfare. And where would she run? She had no allies in this town, no resources, no knowledge of the local terrain. More importantly, she found herself curious about this strange king who claimed he didn't want to break her. It was perhaps the most dangerous emotion she could allow herself, but it was there nonetheless, a tiny flame of interest that she couldn't quite extinguish. "If I come willingly," she said carefully, "what assurance do I have that you won't simply chain me in your dungeon until I learn proper submission?" "You have my word as a king." "The word of a man who buys women at slave markets?" This time, Ronan's smile was visible, brief, but genuine. "The word of a man who's curious enough about your spirit to find out what happens when it's not constantly under attack." Against her better judgment, Lira felt something loosen in her chest. It might have been hope, or it might have been the simple relief of hearing someone acknowledge that her spirit existed at all, that she was more than just a troublesome piece of property to be managed. She stepped down from the platform, her movements fluid despite the chains. "I'll come with you," she said, her voice steady. "But understand this, your majesty. I will not be grateful for your purchase. I will not pretend to be happy about my circumstances, and I will take any opportunity to escape that presents itself." "I would expect nothing less," Ronan replied, and there was something in his tone that sounded almost like approval. The journey to his castle began immediately. Ronan's men had brought an enclosed carriage, though Lira suspected it was less for her comfort than for discretion. The king clearly hadn't planned to make his presence at a slave market widely known, and travelling with a newly purchased Omega would only add to the scandal. As they settled into the carriage, Ronan on one side, Lira on the other, with enough space between them to indicate he wasn't planning to claim any immediate privileges of ownership, she studied him more carefully in the lamplight. His face bore the weathered look of a man who'd spent time on battlefields, rather than just in throne rooms. Scars marked his hands and what she could see of his arms, and there was a weariness in his eyes that spoke of heavy burdens carried for many years. "Why were you there tonight?" she asked suddenly, startling herself with the question. She hadn't meant to show any curiosity about his motivations. Ronan was quiet for several moments, watching the dark countryside roll past through the rain-streaked window. "I've been having trouble sleeping," he said finally. "When that happens, I sometimes walk the city at night. I heard the auction was ending and decided to see what manner of people were still buying and selling at such a late hour. And you decided to become one of them. I decided I couldn't walk away from what I saw." There was something in his voice, a resonance that spoke of recognition, of seeing something in her that had called to him on a level deeper than mere attraction or pity. Lira found herself wanting to understand what he'd seen, even as she fought against the dangerous temptation to trust him. The carriage hit a particularly rough patch of road, sending them both swaying. The chains on Lira's wrists clanked against the wooden seat, a sharp reminder of her status. Without thinking, she began working at the locks with the small metal fragment she'd managed to conceal in her sleeve, a habit so ingrained that she barely noticed she was doing it. Ronan noticed, though. He watched her deft movements with what looked like admiration rather than alarm. "How many sets of shackles have you escaped?" "These will be the 5th, she replied, not bothering to hide her actions. If he planned to keep her chained, he should at least know how futile the effort would be. "Impressive," he said, and sounded like he meant it. "Where did you learn such skills?" Necessity is an excellent teacher. The lock clicked open, and she slipped the shackles off her wrists with practiced ease. For a moment she tensed, ready to fight if he made any move to restrain her again. But Ronan simply nodded approvingly. "Better," he said. "Those looked uncomfortable." Lira stared at him, completely off balance. In her months of captivity, no one, not merchants, not guards, not potential buyers, had ever expressed concern for her physical comfort. The casual way he'd accepted her lockpicking, the approval in his voice when she'd freed herself, the complete lack of anger or alarm at her disobedience, it was all so far outside her experience that she didn't know how to respond. "You're not what I expected a king to be," she said finally. "And you're not what I expected to find at a slave market," he replied. "Perhaps we're both in for some surprises." The carriage rolled on through the night, carrying them toward a castle and a future that neither of them could predict. But for the first time since her capture, Lira wasn't planning her next escape. Instead, she found herself wondering what manner of man this strange king truly was, and whether her life was about to change in ways she'd never imagined possible. The iron gates of Thornwick Castle loomed out of the pre-dawn darkness, like the jaws of some ancient beast. Massive and black, they rose 30 feet into the grey sky, their metal bars thick enough to stop a charging army. As the carriage approached, Lira couldn't help but notice how the gates seemed designed not just to keep enemies out, but to ensure that nothing within could ever escape. The guards who opened the gates moved with military precision, their faces carefully neutral as they glimpsed the king's unexpected passenger. Word would spread quickly through the castle, Lira knew. By breakfast, everyone from the lowest scullery maid to the highest lord would know that their king had returned from his midnight wanderings with a woman whose origins were questionable and whose purpose was unclear. The courtyard beyond the gates was vast and imposing, paved with stones that had been worn smooth by centuries of boots and hooves. Tall towers rose from each corner, their windows dark except for the occasional flicker of torchlight. The main keep dominated the center of the complex, its bulk speaking of power and permanence that had weathered countless storms as they rolled. To a stop before the main entrance, Lira felt the weight of watching eyes from every window. Servants, guards, nobles, all curious about the woman their king had brought home in the dead of night. She lifted her chin, refusing to show any sign of intimidation. She'd faced worse audiences than a castle full of gossips. Ronan stepped down from the carriage first, then turned to offer her his hand. It was a gesture of courtesy rather than command, she realized. He would help her if she wished, but he wouldn't force the issue if she preferred to manage on her own. Such small considerations shouldn't have mattered, but after months of being grabbed, shoved, and manhandled at every opportunity, even basic respect felt like a gift. She ignored his offered hand and stepped down herself, her movements graceful despite the ordeal of the long night. The stone beneath her feet felt solid and real after so many weeks of wagon floors and auction platforms. For a moment, she allowed herself to appreciate the simple pleasure of standing on something that wouldn't rock or sway beneath her weight. "Welcome, to Thornwick," Ronan said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "I know it must seem like another prison to you, but I hope in time you'll find it more than that." Before Lira could respond, the main doors of the keep swung open, revealing a middle-aged woman in a practical grey dress. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her face bore the no-nonsense expression of someone accustomed to managing a large household. This could only be the head housekeeper, the person who would likely have the most immediate impact on Lyra's daily life. "Mrs. Hartwell," Ronan acknowledged with a nod. "This is Lira. She'll be staying with us indefinitely. Please see that she's given suitable quarters and whatever she needs to be comfortable." Mrs. Hartwell's experienced eyes took in Lyra's appearance. The simple dress, the marks on her wrists where the shackles had been, the defiant set of her shoulders. The housekeeper had clearly seen many things during her years of service, and she didn't seem particularly shocked by this latest development. "Of course, Your Majesty," she replied, her tone professional. "Shall I prepare one of the guest chambers in the east wing?" "The tower room," Ronan said after a moment's thought. "The one with the garden view. I think she'll appreciate the windows." Lira caught the subtle meaning in his choice. The tower room would be high enough to discourage escape attempts, but the mention of windows and garden views suggested he wasn't planning to keep her in a dungeon cell. It was another small consideration that she found unexpectedly touching. Mrs. Hartwell's eyebrows rose slightly, but she simply nodded. "Very good, Your Majesty. I'll have Mary prepare the room immediately." She turned to Lira with the expression that was neither friendly nor hostile, simply professional. "If you'll follow me, miss, we'll see about getting you settled." "Actually," Ronan interjected, "I'd like to speak with Lira first. Mrs. Hartwell, perhaps you could have a meal prepared. Something simple. I imagine she hasn't eaten well recently." The housekeeper's expression softened slightly at this consideration for a guest's welfare. "Of course, Your Majesty. I'll see to it personally." As Mrs. Hartwell bustled away, Ronan turned back to Lira. "I thought we should establish some understanding before you're shown to your quarters. You have questions, I'm sure, and I'd rather answer them honestly than leave you to imagine the worst." "How considerate," Lira replied, though her tone was more curious than sarcastic. She was finding it increasingly difficult to maintain her anger in the face of his unexpected courtesy. He led her through the main hall, past tapestries depicting battles and hunts, under the painted gazes of long-dead kings and queens. The castle was impressive but not ostentatious, built for function as much as display. Lira noticed that the servants they passed moved with purpose rather than fear, and several nodded respectfully to their king without the cowering she'd expected in such a hierarchical environment. They entered a smaller chamber off the main hall, one clearly designed for private conversations. A fire burned in the hearth, casting warm light over comfortable chairs and shelves lined with books. Ronan gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, maintaining the distance between them that felt like her last defense. "What do you want from me?" she asked directly, tired of wondering and guessing. "You've made it clear you don't intend to break me, but every man wants something from a woman he's purchased. What's your price?" Ronan settled into one of the chairs, but his posture remained alert rather than relaxed. "I want to understand you," he said simply. "I want to know what made you fight so hard for so long when others would have given up. I want to learn from your strength." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have right now." He leaned forward slightly, his pale eyes intent on her face. "I won't lie to you, Lira. I find you attractive. Any man with eyes would. But if I'd wanted a woman for my bed, there are far easier ways to accomplish that than buying one at a slave market." "Then why?" For a long moment he was quiet, staring into the fire as though searching for words that would make sense even to himself. "Have you ever felt trapped by your own life?" he asked finally. "Surrounded by luxury and power and respect, but somehow unable to breathe freely? Unable to make choices based on what you want rather than what duty demands?" Lira studied his face carefully, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but there was something in his expression, a weariness, a longing that spoke of genuine emotion rather than calculated sympathy-seeking. "You're a king," she pointed out. "You can do whatever you want." "Can I?" His smile was bitter. "I haven't made a truly personal choice in 20 years. Every decision is weighed against the needs of the kingdom, the expectations of the nobles, the demands of politics and diplomacy. I rule absolutely, and yet I'm the least free person in my own realm." "So you bought yourself a pet rebel, someone to live vicariously through?" "Perhaps," he admitted. "Or perhaps I saw someone who'd never stopped fighting for her freedom and hoped I might learn from her example." Despite herself, Lira found his honesty compelling. She'd expected threats or false promises, manipulation designed to make her compliant. She hadn't expected this strange vulnerability, this admission of his own sense of imprisonment, despite all his power and privilege. "I'm not your inspiration," she said firmly. "I'm not your salvation, or your entertainment, or your redemption. I'm a person who wants to be free. And if you're truly different from other men, you'll help me find that freedom, rather than using me to ease your own sense of captivity." "Fair enough," he said, rising from his chair. "But consider this. Perhaps we can help each other find what we're looking for. You want freedom, and I want to remember what it feels like to make choices based on something other than duty. Maybe there's a way for both of us to get what we need." Before she could respond, Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway. "Begging your pardon, Your Majesty, but the room is ready, and cook has prepared a meal." "Thank you," Ronan said. He turned back to Lira. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we can continue this conversation when we're both thinking more clearly." As she followed Mrs. Hartwell from the room, Lira glanced back once to see the king still standing by the fire, staring into the flames with an expression of such profound loneliness that she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The brass bell sat on the small table beside Lira's bed, its polished surface reflecting the morning sunlight that streamed through the tower room's generous windows. Mrs. Hartwell had placed it there the previous evening, explaining matter-of-factly that she need only ring it when she required anything. Food, clothing, assistance of any kind. Lira had stared at the bell for a long moment before asking, "And if I choose not to ring it?" "Then I suppose you'll go without whatever you might have needed," Mrs. Hartwell had replied, with the ghost of a smile. "The choice is entirely yours, miss." Now, 12 hours later, Lira continued to ignore the bell's presence as she stood at the window, watching the castle come alive with the activities of a new day. The view from her room was indeed spectacular. The tower faced east toward gardens that stretched to the outer walls, where climbing roses and flowering vines had transformed stone barriers into things of beauty rather than mere fortification. Below, she could see servants tending to the gardens, their movements unhurried and purposeful. Unlike the harried scurrying she'd expected in a royal household, these people seemed content with their work. Several were actually laughing at some shared joke as they pruned the rose bushes, their voices carrying up to her window on the warm morning air. A soft knock at her door interrupted her observations. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Hartwell or perhaps one of the younger maids. Instead, King Ronan entered, carrying a tray that held a simple breakfast of bread, cheese, fruit, and what smelled like excellent tea. He'd traded his formal attire for practical clothes, leather pants, a simple white shirt, and boots that showed signs of actual use rather than ceremonial display. "I thought you might be hungry," he said, setting the tray on the small dining table near the window. "Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that you declined to ring for anything." Lira turned from the window but didn't move toward the food, despite the fact that her stomach had been growing increasingly vocal about her neglect of it. "I'm not accustomed to asking for what I need." "I imagine not." He pulled out one of the chairs and gestured for her to join him. "But you are accustomed to taking it when necessary. This seems like a reasonable compromise." Despite her wariness, she found herself crossing to the table. The food looked and smelled better than anything she'd encountered in months, and her body's needs were beginning to override her mind's cautions. She sat across from him and began eating with careful dignity, refusing to show how desperately hungry she actually was. "You slept well?" "Better than I have in weeks," she admitted, then immediately regretted the honesty. She didn't want him to think his hospitality was winning her over. "Good. I was concerned the room might be too quiet after—" He paused, seeming to reconsider his words. "After the accommodations you've grown used to, prison wagons and market stalls," he meant, but was too tactful to say it directly. She appreciated the consideration even as she resented needing it. "The bed was softer than anything I've known since childhood," she said. "Though I notice the windows don't open." "They do, actually." He rose and demonstrated, turning a hidden latch that allowed the tall window to swing outward. "But it's a 40-foot drop to the gardens below, and the outer walls are another 100 yards through open ground patrolled by guards who have nothing better to do than watch for unusual movement." Lira walked to the open window and looked down, assessing the distance and the potential handholds offered by the stone walls. It wasn't impossible, but it would require careful planning and probably some rope. She was surprised he'd shown her how to open the window at all. "You're not concerned I'll attempt it anyway?" "I'm sure you will," he replied calmly, returning to his seat. "But I hope you'll give me a chance to prove that staying might be preferable to running." She studied his face, looking for the trap in his words. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" "By treating you as a person rather than property, by giving you choices where I can, by respecting your intelligence and your strength instead of trying to diminish them." He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me, in all the places you've been held, were you ever given meaningful work to do? Anything that engaged your mind rather than just your labor?" The question caught her off guard. She'd been expecting threats or promises, attempts at seduction or intimidation. She hadn't expected him to ask about her intellectual needs. "No," she said finally. "I was kept like livestock, fed enough to maintain my health, exercised enough to keep me presentable, but never treated as though I had thoughts worth considering." "That seems like a waste," he observed. "A mind clever enough to escape from 5 different sets of shackles surely has other talents that are being squandered." Despite herself, Lira felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. When was the last time someone had suggested she might be useful for something other than manual labor or bed sport? "What did you do before?" Ronan continued. "In your village before the raiders came. "I helped my father with his accounts," she said, surprised by how readily the words came. "He was a merchant trader. Not wealthy, but successful enough. I had a head for numbers and could read and write in 3 languages. I managed his correspondence with suppliers in distant towns. Useful skills. Apparently not useful enough to prevent my capture." "No," he agreed quietly, "but certainly useful enough to be valued here, if you were willing." She set down her cup of tea and fixed him with a direct stare. "What are you proposing?" "Work. Real work, using your mind and your skills. I have correspondence that needs managing, accounts that need reviewing, trade agreements that need translating. Nothing terribly exciting perhaps, but challenging enough to keep you occupied if tedium is what you're trying to escape. And in exchange? In exchange, you have a purpose here beyond simply being a curiosity I purchased at market. You have a reason to stay that has nothing to do with locks or guards or walls." Lira was quiet for a long moment, considering his offer. It was tempting, more tempting than she wanted to admit. The thought of using her mind again, of feeling useful and competent rather than merely troublesome, appealed to her in ways that physical comfort never could. But she'd learned to be suspicious of gifts that seemed too generous. "What happens when you grow tired of having a former slave managing your business affairs?" she asked. "What happens when your nobles begin questioning why you trust important work to someone you bought at market?" "Those are fair concerns," he admitted. "I can't promise there won't be challenges, but I can promise that your value here won't depend on my continued interest or anyone else's approval." Competence creates its own authority. She found herself wanting to believe him, which was perhaps the most dangerous development yet. Hope was a luxury she'd learned to avoid. It made disappointment so much harder to bear. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "That's all I ask." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Lira, the work I'm offering, it's not charity. I genuinely need the help, and I think you're capable of providing it. This isn't about making you grateful or keeping you occupied. It's about using your talents for something worthwhile." After he left, Lira returned to the window, staring out at the gardens where servants continued their peaceful work. For the first time since her capture, she found herself considering a future that didn't involve constant planning for escape. The bronze bell caught the light as she turned from the window, its polished surface gleaming like a promise. She walked over to it slowly, lifted it and rang it once. Mrs. Hartwell appeared within minutes, her expression curious but unsurprised. "I'd like to see some of the work the king mentioned," Lira said. "If it's truly available." The housekeeper's face broke into the first genuine smile Lira had seen from her. "I'll let His Majesty know immediately. He'll be very pleased." As Mrs. Hartwell bustled away, Lira realized that for the first time in months she was curious about tomorrow rather than simply dreading it. It was a small victory, but perhaps it was enough to build on. The bell sat silent on the table, but she no longer saw it as a symbol of servitude. Maybe, just maybe, it could be a tool of choice instead. The golden crown sat heavy on Ronan's head as he endured another tedious council meeting, its weight a constant reminder of the burden he'd carried for 23 years. Around the polished oak table, his advisors droned on about tax collections, trade disputes and minor territorial squabbles, the endless minutiae of ruling that consumed his days and haunted his nights. The merchants from Eastport are requesting another extension on their grain shipments, Lord Aldrich was saying, his nasal voice grating against Ronan's already frayed patience. "They claim the late spring has delayed their harvest, but I suspect they're simply trying to negotiate better terms." "What does our new translator think?" Ronan asked, causing several surprised glances around the table. For the past week, Lira had been working through a stack of correspondence that had been accumulating for months. Her facility with languages had proven even more valuable than he'd hoped. She could not only translate the letters, but provide cultural context that helped him understand the true meaning behind diplomatic pleasantries and merchant complaints. She suggests that the merchants are indeed telling the truth about the harvest delays, Ronan continued, consulting the neat summary she'd prepared. Weather reports from that region confirm unseasonably cold temperatures well into what should have been planting season. However, she also notes that similar delays occurred 3 years ago, and Eastport merchants used the opportunity to form a trading consortium that has since dominated grain exports from that region. Lord Aldrich's expressions soured. "Your Majesty surely doesn't place great weight on the opinions of a—" He caught himself before finishing the sentence, but the damage was done. "A what?" Ronan's voice carried a dangerous quiet that made everyone at the table stiffen. "A person of uncertain background," Aldrich finished lamely, clearly realizing he'd overstepped. "Her background is irrelevant to her competence," Ronan replied, his tone brooking no argument. "And her competence has proven far superior to much of what I've been receiving from more traditional sources." The rebuke hung in the air like a blade. Ronan had been growing increasingly frustrated with his council's resistance to any change, their automatic dismissal of anything that didn't conform to decades-old precedent. Lira's fresh perspective had highlighted just how stagnant his advisors had become. Sir Marcus, the oldest member of the council, cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we might arrange to meet this translator. It would help us understand her recommendations if we could discuss them directly with her." "An excellent suggestion," Ronan agreed, though he suspected their motives had more to do with curiosity than professional courtesy. "I'll arrange for her to attend our next session." The meeting continued for another hour, but Ronan found his attention wandering. Through the tall windows of the council chamber, he could see the gardens where Lira often walked while reviewing documents. She'd taken to working outdoors when weather permitted, claiming that fresh air helped her think more clearly. He understood the feeling. The council chamber, for all its grandeur, often felt like a tomb to him, airless and suffocating, filled with the ghosts of decisions made by long-dead kings. Sometimes he wondered if he'd forgotten how to breathe freely anywhere within the castle walls. When the session finally ended and his advisors filed out with their usual mixture of bows and muttered complaints, Ronan removed his crown and set it carefully on the table. The relief was immediate and profound, like setting down a stone he'd been carrying up a mountain. He found Lira in the gardens, seated on a stone bench beneath a flowering apple tree, with a stack of letters spread around her like fallen leaves. She looked up as he approached, and he was struck once again by the vitality in her green eyes, so different from the dull compliance he saw in most of his subjects' faces. "Productive morning?" she asked, her tone suggesting she already knew. "The answer, enlightening," he replied, settling beside her on the bench. "Lord Aldrich nearly choked when I quoted your analysis of the Eastport situation." "I imagine he did." Lira gathered up several of the letters, organizing them into neat piles. "I've been wondering when they'd start questioning your decision to give actual responsibility to a former slave. Does it concern you?" She considered the question seriously. "It should, probably, but I find I'm more interested in the work than worried about the politics. These trade disputes are fascinating puzzles, and your correspondents have a talent for saying one thing while meaning something entirely different. Years of diplomatic training will do that." He watched her sort through the documents with practiced efficiency. "You seem to have a natural gift for reading between the lines." "Survival skill," she said simply. "When your freedom depends on understanding what people really want from you, you learn to listen for subtext." The observation was matter-of-fact, but it reminded Ronan sharply of how different their experiences had been. While he'd been trained in statecraft and diplomacy, she'd learned to navigate far more dangerous waters with nothing but her wits and determination. "The council wants to meet you," he said. "Sir Marcus suggested it would help them understand your recommendations better." "And what do you think they really want?" "To evaluate whether you're a threat to their influence." Lira's smile was sharp, Smart of them to be concerned. I have no patience for incompetence wrapped in ceremony. I've noticed. He found himself returning her smile. Are you prepared to face a room full of men who think your opinions shouldn't matter? I've faced worse audiences. Yes, he said quietly. I suppose you have. They sat in comfortable silence. For a moment, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of the garden. A bee hummed lazily among the apple blossoms, and somewhere in the distance, Ronan could hear the sound of children playing, probably the servants' families, enjoying the warm afternoon. May I ask you something? Lira said suddenly. Of course. Why? Do you wear the crown during council meetings? You clearly hate the weight of it, and everyone in that room knows you're the king regardless of what's on your head. The question surprised him with its perceptiveness. He'd thought he'd hidden his discomfort better than that. Tradition, he said finally. My father wore it, and his father before him. The crown represents the authority of the throne, not just the man who sits on it. But you're not just any man, are you? You're the king who walked alone through a slave market in the rain and bought a woman because something in her defiance called to your buried sense of freedom. Her words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were so devastatingly accurate. When had he become so transparent to her? Perhaps, he admitted. But that king exists only in moments stolen from duty. The rest of the time, I have to be the monarch my people need, steady, traditional, predictable. What if they need something different? What if they need a king who remembers what it feels like to choose his own path? That's a dangerous thought. The best ones usually are. Before he could respond, footsteps on the gravel path announced an approaching interruption. Sir Marcus appeared around a bend in the path, his expression carefully neutral as he took in the scene of his king sitting informally beside the controversial translator. Your Majesty, he said with a bow. Forgive the interruption, but an urgent message has arrived from the northern borders. Lord Commander Hayes requests your immediate attention. Ronan sighed, knowing that his stolen moment of peace was over. Of course he does. He stood, then turned back to Lira. We'll continue this conversation later. I'll be here, she said, already turning back to her letters. As he walked back toward the castle with Sir Marcus, Ronan felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling back onto his shoulders like a heavy cloak. But for the first time in years, he found himself questioning whether that weight was truly necessary, or whether he'd simply grown so accustomed to carrying it that he'd forgotten how to set it down. Behind him, Lira remained in the garden, surrounded by correspondence from across the kingdom. But her attention had shifted from the letters to the man walking away from her, and the expression on her face suggested she was beginning to understand the true nature of his captivity. The crown might be gold, but the bars of his prison were just as real as any she'd ever faced. The war map spread across the vast table in Ronan's private study was a masterpiece of cartographic detail, showing every village, road and river within 100 miles of Thornwick's borders. Red pins marked areas of concern, bandit activity, disputed territories, regions where neighboring kingdoms pressed too close to established boundaries. But it was the cluster of black pins along the northern border that held Ronan's attention this grey morning. Lira stood beside him, studying the map with the same intensity she brought to everything else. Over the past 3 weeks, their working relationship had evolved into something resembling partnership. Her insights had proven invaluable not just for translation work, but for understanding the political undercurrents that drove much of the kingdom's correspondence. The pattern is troubling, she said, tracing a line between several black pins with her finger. These aren't random raids. Someone is testing your defenses, looking for weaknesses. My thoughts exactly. Ronan moved one of the pins slightly, correcting its position based on the latest report. Lord Commander Hayes believes it's King Aldwin of Ravenshollow probing for soft spots before launching a larger incursion. But you're not convinced. It wasn't a question. She'd learned to read his expressions with disturbing accuracy, picking up on doubts he thought he'd kept hidden. The tactics are wrong for Aldwin. he admitted. He's a brute force commander, all cavalry charges and siege engines. This is too subtle, too patient. He indicated the pattern of raids. Someone is gathering intelligence about our response. Times, our troop movements, our supply lines. Someone who understands strategy. Someone who understands me. The admission hung between them, heavy with implications. Lira turned from the map to study his face, her green eyes sharp with concern. You have a suspicion. I have a fear, he corrected. Prince Garrett of Westmarch studied military tactics alongside me when we were young. We trained together, fought together, learned each other's methods. If he's allied himself with Aldwin, it would explain the sophisticated approach. Lira finished. But why would a prince ally with a king like Aldwin? From what I've read in your correspondence, Ravenshollow is hardly a prize worth coveting. Ronan was quiet for a moment, staring at the map with the expression of a man seeing ghosts among the painted boundaries. Garrett and I were friends once, close friends. We were betrothed to sisters, a political arrangement, but one we'd both grown comfortable with. The marriages would have secured a lasting alliance between our kingdoms. What happened? My bride-to-be died of fever 3 weeks before the wedding. Garrett's bride, her sister, took her own life from grief. His voice was carefully controlled, but Lira could hear the old pain beneath his composure. Garrett blamed me for both deaths, said if I'd truly loved Elena, I would have married her sooner, before the fever could take her. Said my delay in formalizing the union had trapped Lydia in an engagement she couldn't escape from, driving her to despair. That's not rational. Blame, grief rarely is. Ronan moved away from the map, walking to the window that overlooked the training yards. He challenged me to single combat, demanded satisfaction for what he called my criminal negligence. I refused, partly from honor, partly from guilt. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps if I'd acted sooner, you would have had a dead wife instead of a dead betrothed, Lira interrupted, her tone sharp with impatience. Fever doesn't negotiate based on marriage contracts. Her bluntness surprised him into a brief smile. You have a refreshing way of cutting through self-pity. I have little patience for it, she replied, but I understand why Prince Garrett might harbor resentment, rational or not. If he spent 15 years nursing that grudge, it could explain why he'd ally with someone like King Aldwin. My crown for her life. That's what he said when he left Thornwick for the last time. He swore he'd see me pay for what I'd cost him. Lira returned to the map, studying the pattern of raids with fresh perspective. If he's directing these probes, he's not just gathering military intelligence. He's looking for something specific. What? Do you mean? Look at the timing, she said, pulling out several of the latest reports. These raids coincide with your council meetings, your public appearances, your travels within the kingdom. Someone is tracking your movements, your habits, your routine. A chill ran down Ronan's spine as he realized what she was suggesting. An assassination attempt, or a kidnapping. If Garrett wants you to suffer, killing you might be too quick. But capturing you, forcing you to watch your kingdom fall while you're powerless to stop it, that would be a fitting revenge in his mind. The strategic implications hit Ronan like a physical blow. If Lira was right, then the northern raids were just a distraction, drawing attention away from the real threat. While his forces focused on protecting the borders, enemy agents could be infiltrating the capital itself. I need to warn Lord Commander Hayes, he said, already moving toward his desk. If there are infiltrators in the city, wait. Lira's voice stopped him mid-stride. If you suddenly change your security arrangements, you'll alert anyone who's been watching you that you've discovered their plan. Better to maintain your routine while quietly increasing protection. You think like a strategist. I think like prey that's learned to hunt, she replied grimly. The question is whether you're prepared to act like a predator instead of a target. Before Ronan could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Sir Marcus entered after receiving permission, his face grave with concern. Your Majesty, I apologize for the intrusion, but we've received troubling news from our agents in Raven's Hollow's court. He glanced uncertainly at Lira, clearly uncomfortable discussing sensitive matters in front of her. "She's part of my inner circle now," Ronan said firmly. "You may speak freely." Sir Marcus's eyebrows rose, but he continued. "Prince Garrett of Westmarch has been seen meeting privately with King Aldwyn. Our informant believes they're finalizing some sort of agreement, though the details remain unclear." Lira caught Ronan's eye across the room, her expression saying clearly that her suspicions had been confirmed. The northern raids, the strategic probing, the careful intelligence gathering, it all fit the pattern of an elaborate trap being prepared. "There's more, Your Majesty," Sir Marcus continued. "Reports suggest that Garrett has been recruiting mercenaries, not soldiers, but specialists, assassins, infiltrators, men skilled in moving unseen through hostile territory." "When?" Ronan asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Within the fortnight, if our intelligence is accurate. 2 weeks. 14 days to prepare for an attack that would likely come from within his own walls, launched by someone who knew his habits, his weaknesses, his methods of defense. Double the guard rotations," Ronan ordered. "But do it gradually, as though we're responding to the northern raids, rather than expecting internal threats. I want background checks run on every servant, every guard, every person who has access to the castle. And Sir Marcus, do this quietly. If there are infiltrators among us, I don't want them to know we suspect anything." "Of course, Your Majesty." After Sir Marcus left, Ronan turned back to find Lira still studying the war map, her expression thoughtful. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking that if Prince Garrett knows you as well as you say he does, he'll expect you to react defensively, increase security, retreat to safer positions, surround yourself with guards." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with a dangerous idea. "What if you did the opposite?" The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a courier whose travel-stained clothes and exhausted horse spoke of urgent haste. Lira was in Ronan's study, organizing correspondence from the eastern provinces, when Sir Marcus burst through the door without his usual formal announcement. "Your Majesty," he gasped, his face pale with shock. "A message from King Aldwyn of Ravenshollow. The courier says it's urgent beyond measure." Ronan took the sealed parchment with steady hands, though Lira noticed the slight tension in his shoulders as he recognized the wax seal. The letter was brief, written in an elegant script that suggested education and careful penmanship. As he read, all color drained from his face. "What is it?" Lira asked, rising from her chair with sudden alarm. Without speaking, Ronan handed her the letter. Her eyes scanned the formal language quickly, but the meaning hit her like a physical blow. "His Royal Majesty King Ronan of Thornwick, it has come to our attention that you currently possess property that rightfully belongs to the Crown of Ravenshollow. The woman known as Lira, daughter of King Edmund of Millhaven, was unlawfully taken from our protection and sold into slavery through criminal conspiracy. As her rightful guardian following her father's death in our service, we demand her immediate return to our custody. Failure to comply within 7 days will be considered an act of war against our realm and our allies. We arrive with a diplomatic escort to collect our ward and discuss terms for avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. King Aldwyn of Ravenshollow by the grace of God and right of conquest." The parchment trembled in Lira's hands as the implications crashed over her. "My father is dead." "It appears so," Ronan said quietly, his voice gentle despite the catastrophic nature of the revelation. "But that's not possible. He was a merchant, not—" She stopped, her mind reeling as pieces of a puzzle she'd never known existed suddenly began falling into place. King Edmund of Millhaven. The room fell silent, except for the sound of her ragged breathing. Everything she'd believed about her identity, her past, her capture, all of it was built on lies or half-truths. "You're not just an Omega," Ronan said slowly, understanding dawning in his pale eyes. "You're royal-born, a princess." "No." Lira sank into her chair, the letter falling from nerveless fingers. "No, that's impossible. My father sold grain and textiles. We lived in a modest house with a small garden. I helped him with his ledgers because we couldn't afford a proper clerk. But even as she protested, memories began surfacing. Details she'd always accepted but never questioned. The way her father had insisted she learn multiple languages, as though she might need them for more than local trade. His extensive correspondence, with contacts she'd never met, in places she'd never heard of. The respect he'd commanded from visitors who seemed far too prosperous to be simple merchants. The night of the raid, she whispered, more to herself than to the others. He fought like a soldier, not a merchant, and they didn't kill him immediately like they did the other men who resisted. They took him alive. Sir Marcus, who had been standing frozen in shock, finally found his voice. Your Majesty, if this is true, if she truly is royal blood, then King Aldwin has every legal right to demand her return, Ronan finished grimly, and every justification for war if we refuse. Lira looked up at him sharply. You would hand me over. After everything, I would rather cut off my own hand, he replied, with quiet intensity. But we need to understand what we're facing. If your father was truly King Edmund of Millhaven, then you're not just nobility. You're the heir to a kingdom that borders both Thornwick and Ravenshollow, a kingdom that no longer exists, Sir Marcus pointed out. Millhaven fell to raiders. 3 years ago, the royal family was reported killed, the territory divided between neighboring realms. But if I survived, Lira began, then you have a legitimate claim to lands that Aldwin has probably already distributed among his supporters, Ronan concluded. Your existence threatens the legitimacy of his conquests. The full scope of the situation was becoming clear. Lira wasn't just a woman stolen from her family and sold into slavery. She was the lost heir to a conquered kingdom, her very existence a threat to the political stability Aldwin had built on her supposed death. He can't let me live, she said, her voice steady despite the fear that must be coursing through her. Even if he claims to want me returned for protection, he needs me dead to secure his hold on Millhaven's territories. Which means this diplomatic mission is actually an assassination attempt disguised as a rescue. Lira stood up, her composure returning as the immediate shock faded. He's coming here with soldiers, claiming legal authority and planning to eliminate the last threat to his stolen crown. Sir Marcus cleared his throat nervously. Your Majesty, perhaps we should consider— No! Ronan's voice cut across whatever diplomatic suggestion the older man had been about to make. We will not hand over a woman who has sought refuge in my kingdom to men who plan her murder. But, Your Majesty, the legal implications— Damn the legal implications. For the first time since Lira had known him, Ronan's careful control cracked, revealing the steel beneath his diplomatic exterior. She came to us as a victim of illegal enslavement. That she's revealed to be nobility doesn't change our moral obligation to protect her. It changes everything legally, Sir Marcus insisted. If we refuse to return her, and King Aldwin has legitimate claim— His claim is based on fraud, Lira interrupted. If my father is truly dead, and if he died in Aldwin's service, as the letter claims, then the circumstances of his death become crucial. A merchant wouldn't die in a king's service unless he wasn't really a merchant, Ronan finished. He was in exile, wasn't he? Hiding in plain sight while Aldwin consolidated his conquest of Millhaven. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. King Edmund hadn't been a simple merchant. He'd been a deposed ruler living in exile, probably gathering intelligence and resources for an eventual attempt to reclaim his throne. The raiders who'd attacked their village hadn't been random brigands. They'd been Aldwin's agents, finally tracking down the exiled king and his heir. They thought they'd killed me in the attack, Lira said slowly. When I survived and was sold into slavery, I became a loose thread that could unravel everything Aldwin has built. And now he knows where you are, Ronan added grimly. A new knock at the door interrupted their discussion. This time it was Lord Commander Hayes who entered, his expression grim with military concern. Your Majesty, Our scouts report a large armed force approaching from the north, flying Raven's Hollow banners, but the size suggests far more than a diplomatic escort. I count at least 200 mounted soldiers, plus supply wagons and siege equipment. How long until they arrive? 3 days, possibly 2 if they push hard. Ronan moved to his desk and began pulling out maps of the local terrain. Defensive positions around the castle? No, Lira said firmly, causing both men to turn toward her in surprise. You can't fight them here. Why not? Thornwick has never fallen to siege. Because I won't let you sacrifice your people for my sake. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held a pain that went deeper than fear for her own life. If you defend me here, Aldwyn will have justification for a full invasion. How many of your subjects will die in a war fought over one woman's life? You're not just any woman, Ronan replied. You're the rightful queen of Millhaven. I'm a woman who's brought danger to people who showed her kindness, she corrected. I won't be responsible for turning your kingdom into a battlefield. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken implications. They all understood the impossible choice facing them: submit to Aldwyn's demands and almost certainly condemn Lira to death, or resist and risk a war that could destroy everything Ronan had spent his life building. There might be another option. Sir Marcus said slowly, his voice thoughtful. What if we're looking at this from the wrong angle? What if instead of seeing this as a demand for surrender, we treat it as an opportunity? What do you mean? Ronan asked. King Aldwyn is coming here openly, with a large force but under the pretense of diplomacy. He's confident, possibly overconfident, and he's bringing his military strength far from his own borders, leaving Raven's Hollow less defended than usual. Lira's eyes sharpened as she began to see where the old knight's thoughts were leading. You're suggesting we turn the hunter into the hunted. I'm suggesting that a queen who has spent months learning to escape from impossible situations might have some ideas about how to survive this one, Sir Marcus replied, with the first smile she'd seen from him. For the first time since reading Aldwyn's letter, Lira felt something other than despair beginning to stir in her chest. It might have been hope, or it might simply have been the familiar fire of defiance that had kept her alive through so much hardship. But whatever it was, it felt like the beginning of a plan. The ancient oak table in Ronan's war council chamber bore the scars of centuries, knife marks from frustrated generals, wine stains from late-night strategy sessions, and the deep grooves worn by countless maps spread across its surface. Now it held what might be the most important battle plan in Thornwick's history, though the war they were preparing to fight would be won or lost not with swords, but with words. Lira stood at the head of the table, no longer the defiant slave. From the auction block or even the competent translator who had earned the council's grudging respect, the revelation of her royal heritage had transformed her in ways that went beyond mere knowledge. She carried herself with an authority that seemed to have awakened from some dormant part of her soul. Aldwyn expects to find a cowering princess begging for protection, she said, her finger tracing the road that led from Raven's Hollow to Thornwick's gates. Instead, he's going to meet the Queen of Millhaven, backed by an alliance with Thornwick, demanding the return of her stolen lands. Lord Commander Hayes frowned at the map. Your Majesty, that is, Your Majesty. He stumbled over how to address both royals in the room. This strategy relies heavily on bluff. If Aldwyn calls our hand and demands proof of your claim, then we provide it, Ronan interjected, placing a leather satchel on the table. Sir Marcus has been busy since yesterday. He opened the satchel to reveal a collection of documents, jewelry, and artifacts. Birth records from Millhaven's archives, saved by loyalists who escaped the conquest. Your father's signet ring, recovered from the battlefield where he fell. Letters in his hand, detailing the exile and his hopes for your eventual restoration. Lira reached for the signet ring with trembling fingers. The gold was tarnished and bore scratches from battle, but she recognized it immediately. She'd seen it on her father's hand every day of her childhood, though she'd never understood its true significance. How did you obtain all this? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. Your father had allies, Sir Marcus explained gently, people who believed in Millhaven's independence and who have been working quietly to preserve its legacy. When word spread that the lost princess had been found, they came forward. They've been waiting for me. They've been waiting for hope, Ronan corrected. You represent the legitimate claim to throne that was stolen through treachery. That gives us legal ground to stand on when we confront Aldwin. Lady Catherine, the newest member of the council and one of the few women to hold such a position, leaned forward intently. The legal framework is solid, but we need to consider the emotional elements as well. Aldwin has ruled Millhaven for 3 years. Some of its people have accepted his authority. They may not welcome the return of their supposedly dead royal family, which is why we're not simply demanding restoration, Lira replied. We're offering alliance. Thornwick and Millhaven united against common threats, with both kingdoms maintaining their independence while supporting each other's security. A federation rather than a conquest, Lord Commander Hayes mused. It could work, especially if we can demonstrate that Aldwin's rule has been harsh enough to make people nostalgic for the old ways. According to our intelligence, it has been, Sir Marcus added grimly. Heavy taxation to fund his military expansion, forced conscription of young men for his army, and summary execution of anyone suspected of loyalty to the old regime. The people of Millhaven have many grievances. Ronan moved to stand beside Lira, studying the tactical positions marked on the map. The timing works in our favor as well. Aldwin is coming here with a significant portion of his mobile forces, men, who could be defending Millhaven's borders instead of threatening ours. If word spread that Queen Lira had returned to reclaim her throne, and if there were coordinated uprisings in key cities, he'd be forced to choose between continuing his mission here or rushing back to secure his stolen crown, Lira finished. Either way, his position becomes untenable. This assumes our agents can coordinate such uprisings, Lady Catherine pointed out, and that the people of Millhaven are ready to rebel. They're ready, a new voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned to see a travel-stained man in simple clothes, his face bearing the weathered look of someone who'd spent years in hiding. Your Majesty, he said, bowing deeply to Lira. Sir Willem of Ashford, formerly captain of your father's guard. I've come to swear my loyalty to Millhaven's rightful queen. Lira stared at him in amazement. Willem, I remember you. You used to give me sword lessons in the courtyard behind our house. You were a quick learner, Your Majesty. Those lessons may serve you well in the days to come. His expression grew grim. I bring word from the resistance cells throughout Millhaven. We have over 1,000 men and women ready to rise at your signal. Merchants who've been bankrupted by Aldwin's taxes, farmers whose sons were pressed into his armies, nobles who've been stripped of their lands and titles, all waiting for word that House Edmund still lives. The atmosphere in the room shifted, electric with possibility. What had seemed like a desperate gamble moments before now felt like a genuine opportunity. How quickly can your people move once the signal is given? Ronan asked. Simultaneously, across 6 major cities and twice as many villages, Willem replied. We've been planning this for 2 years, waiting only for legitimate leadership to rally behind. And if Aldwin responds with brutal suppression, then we die as free people rather than living as slaves, Willem said simply. But we don't think it will come to that. His forces are spread thin, and many of his own soldiers are conscripts from Millhaven. They may not fight as hard against their own countrymen as he expects. Lira looked around the table at the faces of her newfound allies, men and women who were prepared to risk everything on the word of a woman who'd been a slave just weeks ago. The weight of their trust was almost overwhelming. There's something else we need to consider, she said slowly. If we succeed in this plan, if we force Aldwin to retreat and restore Millhaven's independence, it changes everything between Thornwick and me. Ronan met her eyes across the table, understanding immediately what she meant. You would no longer be a refugee seeking protection. You'd be a queen in your own right, free to make your own choices about alliances and—" He paused, the unfinished word hanging in the air between them, relationships. Yes. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the war room, everyone heard it clearly. The implications rippled through the assembled council. What had begun as a rescue mission to protect a woman from assassination had evolved into a plan to restore a queen to her rightful throne. And if it succeeded, the personal bond that had been growing between Ronan and Lira would be transformed into something far more complex. A relationship between equals who would be free to choose their own destiny. "Your Majesty," Lord Commander Hayes said to Ronan, "there's another consideration. If Queen Lira is restored to power, Millhaven becomes a valuable ally, but it also becomes a tempting target for other ambitious kings. We'd be creating a strong buffer state, but also accepting responsibility for defending it." "I can defend my own kingdom," Lira said firmly, causing several surprised glances around the table. "Of course, Your Majesty," Hayes replied diplomatically. "I simply meant that alliance brings mutual obligations." "Mutual obligations freely chosen," Ronan added, his eyes still fixed on Lyra's face, "are the foundation of the strongest partnerships." She held his gaze for a long moment, both of them acutely aware that they were talking about far more than military treaties. "Then we're agreed?" she asked, addressing the entire council. "We meet Aldwyn's diplomatic mission with Queen Lyra's counterclaim, backed by Thornwick's alliance and supported by coordinated rebellion in Millhaven. The risks are enormous," Sir Marcus warned. "If this fails, we face not just war with Ravenshollow, but potential invasion by every kingdom that sees weakness in our position. And if we succeed, we change the balance of power in the entire region," Lady Catherine answered. "A restored Millhaven, allied with Thornwick, creates a bloc strong enough to deter aggression from any single neighbour. More than that," Willemshire added, his voice carrying the fervour of a man who'd waited years for this moment. "We prove that stolen crowns can be reclaimed, that the people's will matters more than a conqueror's strength. The message will echo across every occupied territory in the known world." Ronan stood slowly, his decision made. "Then we send word to our agents in Millhaven. The signal will be given when Aldwyn arrives at our gates and finds not a cowering princess, but a queen ready to fight for her birthright. And if he refuses to negotiate, if he simply demands your surrender under threat of war—" Lyra's smile was sharp as the blade she'd once used to free herself from shackles. "Then King Aldwyn will learn that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the cost." Outside the war room's windows, the sun was setting behind storm clouds that gathered on the horizon. In less than 48 hours, an army would arrive at Thornwick's gates, carrying demands that could reshape the fate of nations. But for the first time since reading Aldwyn's threatening letter, those gathered around the ancient oak table felt something stronger than fear. They felt the dangerous, exhilarating possibility of victory. The white banner snapped in the morning breeze, its pristine fabric a stark contrast against the grey sky where storm clouds gathered like an omen. King Aldwyn's forces had arrived at dawn, their banners and pennants creating a sea of colour across the fields before Thornwick's walls. 200 mounted soldiers, supply wagons, and the unmistakable bulk of siege engines spoke to intentions that went far beyond diplomatic negotiation. Lira stood on the castle's highest tower, watching the elaborate procession arrange itself for maximum intimidation. She wore a gown of deep blue silk, hastily altered from Lady Catherine's wardrobe, and her father's signet ring gleamed on her finger. The crown that had been crafted overnight by the castle's finest goldsmith sat lightly on her dark hair, its simple design echoing the practical elegance of Millhaven's heraldic symbols. "Having second thoughts?" Ronan asked as he joined her at the battlements. He wore his own crown and formal robes, every inch the powerful king, but she could see the concern in his pale blue eyes. "Third and fourth thoughts," she admitted, "but not about our plan, about the cost of failure." Below them, a smaller group detached itself from the main force and approached the gates under the white banner of parley. King Aldwin himself rode at their head, a thick-set man in his 50s whose expensive armor couldn't quite disguise his soft middle. Beside him rode a younger man whose bearing and coloring marked him immediately as Prince Garrett of Westmarch. "Your friend looks older," Lira observed, noting the lines of bitterness that had carved themselves around Garrett's eyes. 15 years of nursed grudges will do that to a man, Ronan replied. "Are you ready for this?" "I've been ready since the night they dragged me from my father's house," she said, straightening her shoulders. "The only difference is now I know who I really am." The great hall of Thornwick had been transformed for the occasion. Banners bearing both kingdoms' arms hung from the rafters, and every noble, knight, and dignitary who could be summoned on. Short notice filled the space. At the far end, 2 thrones had been placed side by side on the raised dais, a clear statement that this meeting was between equals. When the massive doors swung open to admit King Aldwin's delegation, the assembled crowd fell silent. Aldwin entered first, his heavy footsteps echoing off the stone walls, followed by Prince Garrett and a handful of advisors. Their eyes swept the hall, taking in the impressive display of Thornwick's strength before settling on the 2 figures, seated on the thrones. For a moment, Aldwin's confident expression faltered. Whatever he'd expected to find, it clearly wasn't this. A queen in her own right, crowned and clearly established as Ronan's equal rather than his supplicant. King Aldwin of Raven's Hollow. Ronan's voice carried easily through the hall. "Prince Garrett of Westmarch, you are welcome in our court, though the circumstances of your visit give us concern." "King Ronan," Aldwin replied, his voice carefully controlled, "we come seeking the return of property that was unlawfully taken from our protection." His eyes fixed on Lira with undisguised hunger. "The woman you harbor was stolen from our custody and sold into illegal bondage." "You speak of Queen Lira of Millhaven," Ronan replied calmly. "Daughter of the late King Edmund, rightful heir to a throne you usurped through treachery and murder." The accusation hit the hall like a thunderclap. Aldwin's face flushed red with anger, while Prince Garrett's hand moved instinctively toward his sword before he remembered where he was. "Queen," Aldwin sputtered, "this woman is a slave, a piece of property that—" "This woman," Lira interrupted, her voice cutting through his bluster with regal authority, "is the sovereign ruler of Millhaven, formally recognized by Thornwick and prepared to reclaim what you have stolen." She rose from her throne, and despite her youth and slender build, she somehow seemed to fill the entire hall with her presence. "You speak of lawful custody, Aldwin, but by what right do you claim authority over a kingdom's rightful heir? By what law do you hold lands that were taken through assassination and conquest?" "By right of victory," Aldwin snarled, his diplomatic facade finally cracking. "Your father fell in honest battle. My father was murdered under a flag of truce." "While attempting to negotiate the safety of his people," Lira shot back. "Witnesses survived, Aldwin. Your treachery is well documented." Prince Garrett stepped forward, his face twisted with old pain and fresh rage. "You speak of treachery. But what of your own crimes, Ronan? What of the lives lost because of your negligence?" "That's between us, Garrett," Ronan replied quietly. "It has nothing to do with Queen Lyra's legitimate claim to her father's throne." "Everything has to do with it." Garrett's control, finally, snapped completely. "You think you can hide behind pretty words and formal ceremonies, but I know what you are, a man who destroys everything he touches. First Elena and Lydia, now this poor woman you've filled with delusions of grandeur." The hall erupted in angry murmurs at the breach of diplomatic protocol, but Lira raised her hand for silence. When she spoke, her voice was deadly calm. "Prince Garrett, you mistake me for someone who needs protection from her own choices. I am not King Ronan's victim or his pawn. I am Queen Lira of Millhaven, and I demand the return of my stolen kingdom." "Your kingdom is gone," Aldwin declared. "Its people have accepted my rule. They prosper under my protection." "Do they?" Lira smiled, and there was something in her expression that sent a chill through the delegation. "Perhaps you should ask them yourself." Even as she spoke, a commotion arose from outside the castle walls, the sound of horns blowing and distant shouts carrying on the wind. Through the high windows, smoke could be seen rising from multiple points on the horizon. The revolution had begun. The parchment scroll gleamed white against the dark oak table, its surface bearing the most important document to be signed in either kingdom's recent history. The Treaty of Thornwick lay open between two monarchs who had discovered that the greatest victories sometimes come not from conquest, but from the courage to choose something entirely new. King Aldwin was gone. His army scattered to the winds after receiving word that 6 major cities in Millhaven had declared for Queen Lira within hours of each other. Prince Garrett had departed with him, his face a mask of defeat and bewilderment as he realized that his carefully nursed revenge had crumbled in the face of something he'd never learned to understand: genuine partnership between equals. "The terms are acceptable?" Ronan asked, though they'd spent the past 3 hours refining every detail together. "More than acceptable," Lira replied, dipping her quill in the silver inkwell. "A mutual defense pact, open trade agreements, and formal recognition of both kingdom sovereignty. It's everything my father dreamed of when he first spoke of alliance rather than conquest." She signed with careful strokes, her handwriting reflecting the education her father had insisted upon despite their supposedly humble circumstances. "Queen Lira of Millhaven, by grace of God and will of the people, defender of the realm." The title felt both foreign and perfectly natural, like a name she'd always known but never spoken aloud. Ronan added his own signature with equal ceremony. "King Ronan of Thornwick, protector of the northern marches, keeper of ancient laws." But as he set down his quill, Lira noticed something different in his expression, a lightness that hadn't been there even an hour before. "You look relieved," she observed. "I am." He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked truly relaxed. "For 23 years, I've made decisions based on what duty demanded, what tradition required, what politics necessitated. This is the first treaty I've ever signed because I genuinely believed it was right." Through the tall windows of the private chamber where they'd conducted the final negotiations, the sounds of celebration drifted up from the courtyard below. Word of the successful revolution had spread quickly, and both kingdoms were celebrating their newfound alliance. But here in the quiet room, with the treaty signed and their public obligations fulfilled, they found themselves in uncharted territory. "What happens now?" Lira asked, voicing the question that had been hanging between them all day. "Now you return to Millhaven and claim your throne in person," Ronan replied, though his voice carried a note of carefully controlled sadness. "Your people will need to see their queen, to know that House Edmund has truly returned. And after that..." He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the gardens where they'd walked together just weeks ago, when she'd been a translator and he'd been a king trapped by his own crown. "After that, you'll be free to make whatever choices you want. As a sovereign ruler, your alliances, personal and political, will be entirely your own to decide." She heard what he wasn't saying, the offer he was making without putting her under any pressure to accept it. He would not presume that their connection, forged in such extraordinary circumstances, would necessarily survive the transition to their new reality as equal monarchs. "Ronan," she said softly, causing him to turn and meet her eyes, "do you remember what you said the night you bought me at that auction, about wanting to understand what drove someone to keep fighting when any reasonable person would have surrendered?" "I remember. I think I understand now why you recognized something in me that night. You've been fighting your own battles for 23 years, not against shackles and slave traders, but against the expectations that wanted to turn you into something you never chose to be." "Perhaps," he admitted. "The difference is, I always knew I was fighting for my freedom. You forgot that yours was still possible." She stood and walked to where he sat, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. "You don't have to be the king your father was or his father before him. You can be the king you choose to be. And what kind of king is that? One who signs treaties because he believes in them. One who walks through storm-soaked slave markets because he can't stand to see injustice. One who's brave enough to choose love over duty when they're in conflict." He looked up at her, hope and uncertainty warring in his pale blue eyes. "Are they in conflict?" "Not anymore," she said, her smile radiant with possibility. "Queen Lira of Millhaven chooses to ally herself with King Ronan of Thornwick, not just in politics, but in life. If he'll have her." His answer came in the form of rising from his chair and taking her hands in his, the treaty between them bearing witness to the moment when two people who'd found each other in the darkest of circumstances chose to build something. "Right together, two kingdoms," he said quietly. "One future," she replied. "Freely chosen, freely chosen." Outside their window, the celebrations continued as their people rejoiced in their newfound alliance. But here in the quiet chamber, with the afternoon sun streaming through tall windows and the signed treaty still gleaming with fresh ink, the real victory was finally complete. They had both found their freedom, and in doing so, they had found each other. 1 year later, the garden flourished where once the castle's execution grounds had cast their grim shadow over Thornwick's eastern wall. Lira knelt among the flowering rose bushes. Her simple work dress, a far cry from the formal gowns required for state occasions, her hands dark with rich soil as she tended the plants that had become her greatest joy. The transformation had been her first official act as Queen of Millhaven, not the restoration of her own throne, which had taken months of careful negotiation and gradual transition, but this garden. She'd insisted that the space where so much pain had been inflicted be reclaimed for beauty and growth. The symbolism hadn't been lost on anyone, least of all the former prisoners who now worked alongside her in the peaceful labor of cultivation. "Your Majesty," called Marcus, the same auctioneer who had sold her to Ronan what felt like a lifetime ago. He approached hesitantly, his hat in his hands, bearing little resemblance to the confident merchant who had once treated human beings like livestock. Lira looked up from her roses, noting with satisfaction that he still flinched slightly when meeting her eyes. Marcus had been among the first to face justice when she'd begun dismantling the slave trade networks that had proliferated during Aldwyn's chaotic rule. But his sentence had been service rather than imprisonment. She'd learned that redemption was often more powerful than revenge. "The new housing for the refugees from Eastport is ready for your inspection," he reported. "Sir Willem says the families can move in by week's end if you approve the arrangements." "Good," she replied, accepting the hand he offered to help her rise. "And the school? The teacher from the capital arrived yesterday. She says she can accommodate 40 children initially, with room to expand as more families settle." "Excellent." Lira brushed the soil from her hands and gazed out over the gardens that had become a symbol of hope throughout both kingdoms. "Tell Sir Willem I'll visit the new settlement this afternoon. And Marcus, thank you for your dedication to this work. Your father would be proud of the man you've become." The former auctioneer's face flushed with emotion. His transformation from slave trader to refugee coordinator had been one of the most remarkable changes in the year since Millhaven's restoration, and Lira knew it gave him purpose he'd never found in his previous life. After Marcus left, Lira walked slowly through the garden paths, checking on the progress of various plants and simply enjoying the peaceful morning. The roses were responding beautifully to the rich soil that had been enriched by countless small acts of violence being transformed into countless small acts of creation. She paused at the center of the garden, where a simple stone bench sat beneath a flowering apple tree. It was here that she and Ronan had held their first real conversation, where they'd begun to understand that freedom meant something different to each of them, but was equally precious to both. "Lost in thought?" Ronan's voice came from behind her, Warm with affection and gentle humor, she turned to find him approaching along the gravel path, his own clothes practical rather than formal. Leather boots, simple trousers, and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He'd been working in his own gardens, she realized, noting the slight sheen of perspiration on his forehead and the satisfaction in his expression. Reflecting, she corrected, moving into his arms with the easy familiarity of two people who had chosen each other again every day for 12 months. The anniversary makes everything seem more vivid somehow. Good vivid or troubling vivid. Both, she admitted, settling beside him on the bench where they'd planned revolution and discovered love. I keep thinking about the woman who stood on that auction block, so angry and desperate. She couldn't have imagined this. She probably wouldn't have believed it if someone had told her, Ronan agreed, though she might have been intrigued by the possibility of turning her captors into gardeners. Lira laughed, the sound bright and free in the morning air. It still amazed her how easily laughter came now, after so many months when she'd forgotten she was capable of joy. "What about you?" she asked. "Any regrets about the king who used to wear his crown to council meetings and make decisions based purely on duty? Only that it took me 43 years to remember I had a choice," he replied, "though I suspect I needed to meet someone who'd never stopped fighting for hers before I could find my own courage." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching bees work among the flowers and listening to the distant sounds of children playing in the refugee settlement. Both kingdoms had changed dramatically in the year since Aldwyn's defeat and exile. Trade flourished under the new alliance, former slaves had been freed and compensated for their suffering, and a generation of children was growing up with the knowledge that birth circumstances need not determine destiny. "I have something for you," Ronan said suddenly, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small object wrapped in silk. Lira accepted it curiously, unwrapping the fabric to reveal a simple silver ring set with a small green stone that perfectly matched her eyes. It was beautiful in its understated elegance, but what took her breath away was its symbolism, not a shackle to bind her, but a freely chosen commitment between equals. "Ronan," she whispered, turning the ring in the sunlight and watching it gleam. "1 year ago, a king bought a woman at a slave market because he saw something in her defiance that called to his own buried longing for freedom," he said quietly. "Today, that same man, no longer quite the same king, asks that woman, now revealed as a queen, if she would choose to bind her life to his, not from duty or politics or even gratitude, but simply because they've discovered that freedom shared is sweeter than freedom alone." She looked up from the ring to meet his eyes, seeing in them the same mix of vulnerability and hope that had first caught her attention in that storm-soaked square. "Are you asking me to marry you, King Ronan of Thornwick? I'm asking you to choose me," he corrected, "every day for the rest of our lives, if you want to." "I want to," she said, slipping the ring onto her finger where it fit perfectly. Another symbol of how thoroughly their lives had become intertwined. Every day, freely chosen. When they kissed, surrounded by the garden they'd created from a place of execution and despair, the taste was of possibility and hope, and the sweet knowledge that the greatest victories are often the quietest ones. 2. People choosing love over fear, freedom over control, and the future over the past. In the distance, church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to prayer and marking another day in kingdoms where former slaves worked as equals beside former masters, where queens knelt in gardens and kings chose love over duty, and where the most revolutionary act of all was the simple decision to build something beautiful in place of something broken. The storm-soaked auction block was long gone, replaced by the marriage altar where two souls who had recognized each other in darkness would soon choose to walk together toward whatever light the future might hold.